In 1977, a team of paleopathologists unwrapped the mummy of Rameses II, the most powerful man who had ever lived in Africa, the pharaoh who signed the world's first recorded peace treaty, the ruler whose reign lasted 66 years and whose monuments still stand, and found that his aorta was almost completely blocked with calcified arterial plaque. He had severe atherosclerosis. He had dental abscesses so advanced that the infection had spread into the bone of his jaw. He had ankylosis of the spine. He had, preserved in his intestinal tissue, the calcified eggs of intestinal parasites that had been living inside him for decades. Rameses II, the man with his own temple at Abu Simbel, the man history remembers as a god. He ate what everyone else ate. He drank what everyone else drank. He waded through the same water. And his body recorded every meal for 3,000 years in a language that nobody could read until a team of scientists in a Manchester laboratory finally understood what they were looking at. This is not a story about the food of ancient Egypt being bad by the standards of the ancient world. By those standards, it was extraordinary. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean for a reason. People did not come to Egypt to starve. They came to Egypt and they ate a single ordinary meal, and that meal began doing things to their bodies that no one, not the physicians with their papyri, not the priests with their ritual knowledge, not the pharaoh with his army of healers, had any framework to understand or any power to stop. You would not have survived it either. And I'm going to walk you through exactly what would have happened to you, starting with the moment you sat down to eat. Before we get to the meal itself, you need to understand the world that produced it, because the food does not make sense without the Nile, and the Nile does not make sense without understanding that it was simultaneously the reason Egypt existed and the primary mechanism by which Egypt was killing its own people. The Nile flooded every year between June and September. It deposited silt. The silt made the soil rich. The rich soil produced the grain surplus that built the pyramids, funded the armies, and kept the population fed through droughts that collapsed every other civilization within 500 miles. The annual flood was not a natural disaster. It was the entire agricultural operating system of ancient Egypt. And without it, nothing worked. With it, everything worked. The fields, the granaries, the ration system, the state itself. Here is what the flood also deposited, along with the silt. Schistosoma hematobium, a parasitic flatworm whose larvae live in fresh water, whose intermediate host is a species of freshwater snail that thrives specifically in slow-moving irrigation channels, whose life cycle requires a human or animal host to complete, and whose larvae penetrate skin on contact, not through cuts, not through drinking, just through contact, through wading, through the ordinary physical act of standing in water, and then travel through the bloodstream to the veins surrounding the bladder and intestines where they live, lay eggs, and slowly destroy the surrounding tissue for the rest of your life. The more successfully Egypt farmed, the more irrigation channels it maintained. The more irrigation channels it maintained, the more snail habitat it created. The more snail habitat it created, the more larvae in the water. The more larvae in the water, the more Egyptians wading through it every morning to tend the fields. Modern analysis of Egyptian mummies has found evidence of schistosomiasis in between 50 and 75% of the remains examined, depending on the site. This was not an outbreak. This was not a plague. This was the baseline condition of the majority of the Egyptian population, running continuously through the entire span of the civilization. The farmers who fed the ancient world were being systematically hollowed out by the fields they worked. And you, sitting down to your meal in ancient Egypt, had almost certainly already been infected before you even started eating, because you walked through the irrigation channel on the way to the market, because the water you used to wash your hands came from the canal, because in ancient Egypt there was no water that was not the Nile, and the Nile was not safe. But we'll come back to what the parasite was already doing to you. First, let's talk about what you were about to eat. Your meal was grain. It was almost certainly grain, not as a side element, not as one component among many. As the meal, bread, beer, and whatever could be acquired to accompany them. Emmer wheat and barley dominated the Egyptian agricultural landscape with a completeness that is difficult to overstate. Agricultural workers drew roughly 80% of their total calorie intake from grain. In workers' ration records from Deir el-Medina, the village of the men who carved the Valley of the Kings, the most thoroughly documented settlement in the ancient world, show a daily allocation of approximately 10 loaves of bread per person, alongside a measure of beer. This was not a ration that supplemented a broader diet. This was the diet. The bread was made from grain ground between millstones of sandstone and granite. The grinding process was unavoidably contaminated. Grit from the stones, fine sand blown in from the desert, fragments of the grinding basin itself. All of it ended up in the flour, baked into the loaf, placed in front of you as your meal. You could see some of it if you looked closely. You ate it anyway because everyone ate it and everyone had always eaten it and there was no other bread. The beer in your cup was not beer in any sense you would recognize. It was thick, cloudy, nutritionally dense, and required straining through a wicker sieve before drinking because otherwise you were eating as much as swallowing. It was brewed from partially baked grain, dissolved in water, and left to ferment in clay vessels that were never sterilized between batches, accumulating the biological history of every previous brew in their walls. The alcohol content was low, around 2 to 3%. The Deir el Medina workers received 4 to 5 liters of it per day as part of their official government ration, not as a luxury, as fuel, as the thing that kept them standing. If you had access to fish, and many Egyptians did, because the Nile produced tilapia and catfish and Nile perch in abundance, it arrived dried, salted, or lightly fermented, preserved in the sun and the heat according to methods that worked well enough to prevent obvious spoilage, not well enough to kill everything living in the flesh. This was your meal, bread that tasted faintly of stone, beer the texture of thin porridge, fish dried in the delta sun, water from the canal to wash it down. Now, let's talk about what happened next. You finish eating. You feel fine. This is the most important detail in the entire story, and I need you to sit with it for a moment. You feel completely fine. In the first hour after your meal, you are unaware of anything unusual because nothing unusual is happening yet. Your digestive system is processing bread and beer and dried fish the way it has processed bread and beer and dried fish every day of your life. The grit from the millstones is moving through your system. Your stomach is doing what stomachs do. What you cannot feel is what is already in the flour. Aspergillus flavus is a mold that grows on stored grain, particularly in hot and humid conditions, particularly in the kind of mud brick granary silos that Egyptian agriculture depended on. It produces aflatoxin, one of the most potent naturally occurring carcinogens ever identified. In the short term, aflatoxin produces nothing you would notice. It does not taste like anything. It does not cause immediate illness. What it does, consumed regularly over months and years, is accumulate in the liver, interfere with cellular DNA, and significantly increase the risk of hepatocellular carcinoma, liver cancer, in modern terms. In ancient Egyptian terms, in a wasting illness that began with fatigue and abdominal swelling, and ended with the kind of death that the Ebers Papyrus would have attributed to a dangerous accumulation of the poisonous substance WHDW traveling through the body's channels. Treatment, purging, enemas, laxatives to expel the corrupted substance. You can see the problem, but the aflatoxin is a slow story. The fish tapeworm is faster. Heterophyes. Heterophyes is a small intestinal fluke whose larvae insist in the flesh of Nile fish. They survive light salting. They survive incomplete drying. When you eat the fish and the cyst reaches your small intestine, the larva excysts, attaches to the intestinal wall, and begins producing eggs within a week. In light infections, you might notice nothing beyond intermittent diarrhea and mild abdominal cramping, symptoms so common in ancient Egypt that they would not have distinguished themselves from baseline in any meaningful way. In heavier infections, the eggs are carried through the intestinal wall into the lymphatic system and the bloodstream, traveling to the heart and the brain and the spinal cord. Cardiac involvement produces arrhythmias. Neurological involvement produces symptoms that Egyptian physicians would have recorded carefully, attributed entirely incorrectly, and treated with something that made everything worse. You still feel fine. It has been 2 hours since your meal. Here is where the Nile water enters the story in a different way. The water you drank with your meal, or used to rinse the clay cup, or splashed on your face before sitting down, carried schistosoma larvae if you drew it from the canal, which you almost certainly did. And if you had not already been infected through wading that morning, the larvae in the water could penetrate the mucous membranes during swallowing, beginning a journey that would take them through your portal circulation to the liver, where they would mature over 4 to 6 weeks into adult worms, then migrate to the vesical venous plexus, the network of veins surrounding your bladder, where the female would begin laying eggs for the rest of her life. The first symptom you might notice, weeks after that meal, is a rash where the larvae entered the skin. Medical texts from the period describe this. They did not connect it to water contact. Several weeks after that, you might develop fever, chills, all muscle aches, and a cough. The Egyptian physicians had a name for this stage. They did not know it was caused by a parasitic worm. They treated the fever with herbal compounds, some of which were genuinely anti-inflammatory and may have provided mild symptomatic relief, none of which touched what was causing it. Months after the meal, if the infection progressed, and in a population with repeated exposure and no treatment, it progressed, you might notice blood in your urine. This was so common in ancient Egypt that certain medical texts treat it almost as a normal developmental milestone in young men. Researchers have found Egyptian texts that read, in translation, as something close to, "This is a thing that happens to boys. It will pass if you are strong." It did not pass. The eggs lodged in the bladder wall. They lodged in the intestinal wall. The immune response to each individual egg produced a granuloma, a small nodule of scar tissue that the body built around the foreign object it could not expel. Multiply those granulomas by the tens of thousands of eggs a mature female schistosome lays every day. Multiply that by years of infection. The bladder wall thickens. The intestinal wall thickens. The liver accumulates scar tissue around the eggs that travel there through the portal circulation. Portal hypertension develops. The spleen enlarges. The abdomen fills with fluid. By the time any of this was visible, by the time your physician was looking at you and recording your symptoms in the careful clinical language of the medical papyri, the process had been running for years. The meal that started it was long forgotten. The water you washed your hands in that morning was not a thing anyone thought to connect to the swelling in your abdomen. Your physician would have told you your WW levels were dangerously elevated. He would have prescribed a purge. He would have been confident in this diagnosis because the papyrus said so, and the papyrus had been right about so many other things. You would have been purged. Your already compromised and inflamed intestinal lining would have been subjected to aggressive laxative treatment. And then you would have been sent home to eat bread and drink beer and wade through the irrigation canal the next morning. This is the moment in the story where most people expect a pivot to the ways that Egyptian medicine was secretly better than it looked. And in fairness, it was in specific areas. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a surgical document of genuine sophistication, a systematic case study approach to traumatic injuries that distinguishes between treatable, potentially treatable, and untreatable conditions with a clinical honesty that is striking. Egyptian physicians understood the role of the pulse and its connection to the heart. They had dental specialists, eye specialists, and a pharmacopoeia that included compounds we now know have genuine anti-inflammatory or antimicrobial properties. The Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BCE, but drawing on knowledge accumulated over centuries, contains over 700 remedies and represents one of the most impressive documents produced by the ancient world. The physicians who used it were serious professionals with real observational skills and genuine commitment to their patients. But none of that helped with what was eating you from the inside, because the framework for internal disease, the theory of WHDW, the belief in humoral imbalance, the connection between corrupted substances and illness, was confident, coherent, and entirely wrong. And a wrong framework, applied with total confidence by a skilled physician, is more dangerous than no framework at all, because it prevents you from looking for the right answer while actively making the patient worse. The beautiful, terrible irony of Egyptian medicine is that its sophistication in some areas made it more lethal in others. A civilization observant enough to build a complex pharmacopoeia, detailed enough to produce hundreds of precisely described remedies, rigorous enough to distinguish treatable from untreatable conditions. That same civilization looked at a population being systematically destroyed by parasites in the water and the grain and the fish, and concluded that the problem was a spiritual imbalance in the body's channels. They treated the wrong thing, with confidence. For 3,000 years. When archaeologists excavated the cemetery at Deir el-Medina, they found bodies that told the same story the mummies told, at a scale that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Dentalware ground to the gum line from decades of grit-laden bread, skeletal evidence of anemia consistent with chronic parasitic blood loss, spinal degeneration from heavy labor on a diet inadequate in fat-soluble vitamins, life expectancy clustering in the 30s and 40s, all with survival to 60 representing a genuine statistical outlier. These were the skilled workers, the men who received government rations, who had steady employment, who lived in a purpose-built village with access to the state medical system. If this was how the skilled workers looked, the condition of the agricultural laborers in the Delta, eating less reliably and wading through more water, can be inferred. And yet, the civilization functioned. The monuments were built. The grain was harvested. The rations were distributed. The papyri were compiled, and the remedies were mixed, and the priests performed their ritual ablutions in the Nile every morning, dosing themselves with schistosome larvae in the service of their religious obligations. And the civilization kept going, because individual bodies breaking down was simply the cost of maintaining it, and the cost was invisible because it was universal. And it was universal because no one had any framework to see it as a cost at all. Rameses II lived to 90. His teeth were abscessed, his arteries were blocked, his spine was fused, and his intestines contained the legacy of decades of parasitic infection. He outlived almost everyone he had ever known. By ancient Egyptian standards, he was a medical miracle, a man favored by the gods, proof that the system worked. By any other standard, he was a man who had been slowly taken apart by his breakfast for 90 years, and simply lasted longer than the others. In 1977, when the team in Manchester finished their examination of Rameses II and published their findings, they were documenting the end of a process that had begun the first morning of his life, when someone gave him water from the Nile and grain ground on a sandstone quern and fish dried in the Delta sun and called it nourishment. And it was nourishment. It kept him alive. It kept Egypt alive. It built the monuments and fed the armies and sustained the most durable civilization the ancient world would ever produce. It just did all of that, while systematically destroying the bodies of every person who consumed it, one meal at a time, in ways that no one understood and no one could stop, because the damage was invisible and the connection was unthinkable, and the alternative was starvation, which was worse. In a village in the Nile Delta, 3,000 years ago, a man finished his bread and his beer, rinsed his cup in the canal water, and went to work feeling fine. He felt fine for a long time, and then he didn't. And then his physician came and prescribed a purge and he got worse. And then he died, in his 30s or his 40s, of something that had been in his breakfast since the first day he ate it. His mummy is in a museum somewhere. His teeth are worn to stumps. His intestinal tissue, if anyone has examined it, contains the eggs that were already there the morning after that meal. He felt completely fine when he finished eating. That's the part that should stay with you. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up at night, the subscribe button is right there. There is significantly more where this came from.